From the moment humans discovered radio waves, we understood only half of what they represented. We knew how to transmit, how to receive, how to bounce signals off the upper layers of the atmosphere and send voices across oceans. But what we never fully understood were the shadows that exist between frequencies, those empty spaces filled not with silence, but with something far stranger. For more than a century, operators have reported voices that should not be there, signals that appear only once before fading forever, and coded messages from no known agency, nation, or origin. Beneath the static lies another world, a world that listens back. On a winter night in 1996, a handful of amateur radio operators across northern England and southern Scotland encountered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The incident, later nicknamed the Midnight SOS, remains one of the most perplexing broadcasts ever captured. A distress call from a place that should have been silent, spoken by a voice that did not belong on any active frequency, relayed through interference unlike anything listeners had ever heard. It lasted 38 seconds, and then it vanished.
To understand the significance of those 38 seconds, one must understand the people who were awake to hear them. Amateur radio operators are not insomniac hobbyists with antennas in their attics, though some are exactly that. They are, in truth, custodians of abandoned frequencies. They guard the parts of the electromagnetic spectrum where official agencies have long since stopped listening. Unlike the polished voices of modern broadcasting, ham operators sit in dimly lit rooms surrounded by dials, oscilloscopes, and walls plastered with world maps. They know the weather patterns that bend waves, the solar activity that warps transmissions, and the subtle hum of man-made interference. They know, perhaps better than anyone else, when something is wrong. Shortly after midnight on February 17, 1996, the wrongness began. It started with a low, irregular rumble. Something not atmospheric, not electrical, not mechanical. Operators described it as a grinding hum, like metal being bent slowly under immense pressure. This sound bled into a dead frequency in the 460 kilohertz range, a band completely abandoned by emergency services and commercial transmitters. No one should have been broadcasting there. Then 3 tones emerged, long, piercing, evenly spaced. They resembled a maritime distress pattern, but not one recognized by any emergency protocol. They carried a strange harmonic warble, as if the source of the tones was vibrating or shaking violently while transmitting. And then the voice appeared. At first, it was nearly inaudible, faint, fractured, layered beneath thick static. But slowly, word by word, the transmission gained clarity. What the operators heard next sent chills through every person tuned in. Mayday, Mayday, anyone receiving, please respond, please. The voice belonged to a man, breathless, strained, possibly injured. Several listeners later remarked that he spoke like someone who had been running, or hiding, or bracing himself against something unseen. There was desperation not only in his words, but in the pauses between them. The silence felt intentional, as though he were listening for something nearby. The message broke apart twice, crushed by sudden bursts of distortion. The distortion was unlike any form of interference the operators had encountered before. It wasn't the typical flutter of ionospheric scattering, nor the rolling fade of skywaves. It came in sharp, rhythmic pulses, almost mechanical, almost alive.
But when the transmission stabilized, the operators caught something unmistakable. Coordinates, spoken carefully, deliberately, but trembling. The numbers pointed to a location deep inside Kielder Forest, a remote region with no airfields, no coastlines, and no navigational beacons. Nothing capable of sending a maritime Mayday could have been anywhere near it. What came next would cement this story into radio folklore forever. If anyone hears this, they're not human.
Static exploded across the frequency, a violent blast that rattled speakers and sent needles spiking. At least one operator later claimed that the interference was so powerful, it briefly cut power to his transceiver. Others reported their equipment heating rapidly, as though the broadcast carried an energy far beyond a normal signal. The voice tried to speak again, 2 faint syllables, swallowed instantly, and then the frequency fell silent. Completely. Absolutely. Irrevocably. Silent.
There were no follow-up transmissions, no repeats, no looping distress calls, nothing. Over the next half hour, something even stranger happened. Operators across 3 counties attempted to transmit back. Every attempt failed. Their outgoing signals were either absorbed or scattered, vanishing the moment they hit the frequency band. It was as if the frequency had closed itself. By dawn, the small community of night shift operators had spread the story among themselves. They compared notes, shared recordings, analyzed waveform patterns. What they found was unnerving. The distortion patterns were identical in every recording. Every pop, every crack, every surge, each occurred at the exact same millisecond across all tapes.
This meant the interference wasn't coming from their equipment or from atmospheric conditions. It was embedded inside the broadcast itself, something affecting the signal before it ever reached them. Who or what designed a transmitter like that?
By afternoon, a few operators contacted local authorities. The response was predictably apathetic. No missing pilots, no missing hikers, no missing maritime vessels, no reported emergency of any kind. The coordinates meant nothing to them. The fact that the message arrived on a dead frequency meant even less. But the operators insisted something was wrong, and they weren't the only ones. Within 24 hours, 3 unrelated sightings were reported near Kielder Forest.
A forestry worker claimed he heard a deep, metallic hum pulsing through the trees. Steady, rhythmic, unnervingly smooth. He compared it to a turbine running underwater. The sound persisted for nearly 10 minutes before fading abruptly. A hill walker, hiking alone, reported seeing pale blue beams sweeping across the tree canopy. Not flashlight beams, not helicopter searchlights. These moved too smoothly, too silently, with no accompanying aircraft noise. A third witness, driving near the southern edge of the forest, recalled seeing a circular glow emanating from between the trees. He said the glow was cold, not warm like fire, and it illuminated the trunks in a perfect ring. None of these witnesses knew anything about the Midnight SOS.
2 days later, rangers discovered a strange clearing inside the forest. The trees were bent outward from the center. Unusual, as natural disturbances typically pull or push trees in a single dominant direction. But here, the trunks curved away in a perfect radial pattern, as if something had expanded explosively from the center without producing heat or flame. The soil in the clearing was mildly magnetized, not scorched, not disturbed, simply magnetized.
Investigators found no wreckage, no debris, no devices, no crash signatures, no tire tracks, no footprints. The clearing seemed manufactured and abandoned in the same moment. For the next 19 nights, something even more baffling occurred. At exactly 12:14 a.m., the same time the original SOS was broadcast, the frequency emitted a low, steady pulse. Each pulse lasted precisely 7 minutes. It was perfectly rhythmic, almost heartbeat-like, and identical every night. Then, on the 20th night, it stopped forever.
Signal analysts who studied the pulse described it as structured, consistent, intelligent, non-random, non-terrestrial in its modulation pattern, yet no government agency, no military organization, and no private research facility ever stepped forward to claim it.
In 2004, a group of independent researchers visited the clearing with ground-penetrating radar. What they found was ambiguous. No structures, no metallic objects, no cavities or tunnels. But they did detect a faint electromagnetic residue deep below the soil, something that suggested the presence of a powerful source that had either decayed or moved. One of the researchers described it in her notes as a fingerprint without a hand.
For decades, skeptics have attempted to dismantle this story. They argue that memory is fallible, that isolated anomalies get exaggerated, that people fill gaps with imagination. But skeptics cannot explain away the recordings. They exist. They are consistent. And the embedded distortions remain one of the most curious technical anomalies in amateur radio history.
The voice in the recording doesn't sound like a prankster. It doesn't sound like an actor. It doesn't sound like someone play-acting distress for the sake of a hoax. It sounds like a man genuinely terrified, desperately attempting to reach anyone, anywhere, who might hear him.
One operator, now in his 70s, still keeps his original recording in a weathered case beside his transceiver. When interviewed years later, he said, "I've heard pranks. I've heard pirates. I've heard kids fooling around with CB radios. This wasn't that. This was a man calling from somewhere he shouldn't have been. Somewhere he wasn't alone." Another operator devoted 21 years of his life to triangulating the exact point of origin, using outdated logs, archived geomagnetic data, and hundreds of amateur reports. He died before completing the project. On his desk, researchers found notebooks filled with concentric circles, overlapping triangles, and notations about signal decay that pointed to one unsettling conclusion. The signal most likely came from below ground. Not air, not sea, not orbit. Underground. But no tunnels exist beneath that region. No bunkers. No abandoned mine shafts deep enough to enable transmission that strong. Nothing created by humans, at least none officially recorded. In 2018, a newer, more sensitive spectrum analysis of the original recording revealed something previously unnoticed, a faint harmonic underlayer beneath the voice. Not noise, not static, a pattern, a structured, repeating modulation embedded so subtly it would have been undetectable with 1990s equipment. The pattern did not match any known encryption scheme, musical structure, or digital encoding method. It resembled breathing. Slow, steady, mechanical breathing. What was listening on the other end of that SOS? Who was the message meant for? And why, after almost 30 years, has the frequency remained utterly silent? The Midnight SOS remains, to this day, a singular mystery. One that sits at the intersection of physics, fear, and the unknown. It represents a moment where a voice slipped through the cracks of our safe, well-mapped world and into the headphones of ordinary people who were never meant to hear it. A voice that begged for help. A voice that claimed they're not human. A voice that was never heard again. Somewhere in the endless ocean of radio static, a desperate call crossed a boundary we still do not understand. A message traveled through darkness, searching for a listener.
For a brief moment, it found one, but the help it needed never came, and the silence that followed has lasted longer than any human voice ever could.